Yeah, here we go. Oh, this is a really good one. Hi everybody, my name's Meaghan Anderson. I'm a field agronomist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and today we're in the agronomy teaching greenhouse, and I'm here to talk about the late emerging weeds that we see in crop fields every year. And so we've grouped them together again by their emergence sequence because it can help us in identifying, especially with the early emerging weeds, whether or not one species is potentially out in the field or not. But these are the late emergers, and these ones are particularly difficult to manage in our crops because they come up primarily after we have planted the crop, which means that we have to rely on any post-emergence management tactics to kill them. And so three weeds that I have right here are Amaranth species. So all of these Amaranth species are fairly late emergers. They have pretty similar emergence patterns, and the big difference between them is that some of them are common and challenging to manage in our crop fields, and some of them have been easier to manage historically, and we don't see them as much. So the first species is Palmer Amaranth. And so this weed is particularly challenging to manage. It's new to the state of Iowa, but this is a really late emerger, very competitive with the crop. We often say that this has some characteristics of our problematic weed Waterhemp, but it also has characteristics of giant ragweed. It grows big, it competes more with the crop, and identifying Palmer Amaranth as a seedling is really, really hard. And so mostly I just want to point out that this looks very similar to the other two Amaranth species that we're going to talk about, in that they all have fairly similar linear type cotyledons, those first leaves. And then they also have just sort of a nondescript. They can have kind of an ovate or like an egg-shaped leaf, or in some cases, depending on the biotype that you're looking at, you may see kind of a longer or a skinnier leaf on it. I will say that the ovate leaf shape is more common on Palmer Amaranth than it is on Waterhemp, but there's so much variability it's nearly impossible to tell them apart. If you do have a hand lens, which we always suggest having when you're trying to ID small plants, Palmer Amaranth should be pretty much hairless. The next species is really common in Iowa crop fields. Of course, this is Waterhemp. There are going to be slight differences between Waterhemp and Palmer Amaranth. You may notice that the leaves are a little longer and skinnier. The cotyledons actually are maybe slightly more of almost like a diamond shape or a lanceolate. They've got a little bit of a widening as opposed to being as straight and skinny. But again, hairless seedlings and nearly impossible to differentiate from the other amaranths. Basically what we can tell when we see them come up in the field, especially at that cotyledon stage, is we want to be able to identify them as an amaranth. And then finally we have red root pigweed. So this is one of our less common pigweeds. We just don't run into it as much anymore like we did maybe 30 years ago. This is similar to the Palmer Amaranth in that it's got those long skinny cotyledons, and it often will have more of an ovate shaped leaf. All of these have alternate leaves. The big difference between red root pigweed and the other species is if you get a hand lens out and you look at the stem, they are going to be fuzzy. We do have pubescence on the stem, and we should have pubescence on the leaves too as they get larger. The last of the late emerging species, totally different than our amaranths, is ivy leaf morning glory. And so morning glory species are really easy to identify because they have really, really neat cotyledons. So if you look at these first leaves, we call them like a butterfly shaped cotyledon, and that's very distinct. So when we see these cotyledons come up out in crop fields, there's only a handful of species it's going to be, and it's very likely going to be a morning glory. Ivy leaf happens to be basically the most common one that we typically run into, and you can see that those leaves have usually 3 lobes and look very much like ivy. Alternate leaves, so you can see one leaf is bigger than the next leaf, right? So this one's developed later than this leaf was. There's also a tall morning glory species that will have the same type of cotyledons, but instead of having that ivy-shaped leaf, it'll have a heart-shaped leaf instead. So these are 4 late emerging species. Like I said, they're challenging to manage in our crop fields because they emerge basically with or after the crop. And in the case of the amaranths, they have really long emergence patterns, which makes it hard to get control of them. So keep an eye out for these late emergers in the fields and look for the keys to identifying them that I've given you today. We're here in the agronomy greenhouse.
Okay.
I'll be fine.
Ready to go?
Sure.